Hello, my name is Dale Melcher, and I'd like to welcome Ellen Meeropol for a reading from and conversation about her new novel, Her Sister's Tattoo. Ellen is the author of 3 previous novels, Kinship of Clover, On Hurricane Island, and House Arrest. Her work has been honored by the Women's National Book Association, the Massachusetts Center for the Book, the PBS NewsHour, and the American Book Fest. Ellen is a founding member of Straw Dog Writers Guild and leads their social justice writing program. She holds an MFA in fiction from the Stone Coast program at the University of Southern Maine, and you can find more information and links to other published pieces on her website, ellenmeeropol.com. Angela Davis wrote this about Her Sister's Tattoo. The elegant restraint of Ellen Meeropol's prose and the painstaking precision of her vision offers us discerning glimpses over decades and generations into the complexities of political engagement, its big questions, and especially its intimacies. At a time when radical movements are on the rise, we hope we find in Her Sister's Tattoo exactly what we need now, both caution and hope. Marge Piercy called it an honest and riveting portrait of anti-war activists and the price individuals and families pay for their actions, no matter how just. It's also a portrait of how lies and secrets can eat away again at both individuals and everyone in their families, particularly children. I would call it a timeless story about resistance and family, about the intersection of the personal and the political. I am particularly delighted to introduce Ellie and have a conversation with her about this beautifully written and compelling story. We have been friends and comrades since the early 70s, finding kinship in our 60s anti-war and feminist activism, and our commitment to social and economic justice. We've raised our children, engaged in our communities, taken to the streets, and had endless conversations about family and politics. Please welcome Ellen Meeropol.
Thank you so much, Dale. Her Sister's Tattoo is the story of Rosa and Esther. They grew up in a working-class Jewish family in Detroit, grew up attending union rallies and civil rights protests. They are very close, even sharing a best friend, Maggie. But in the time of crisis in this novel, their perspectives diverge wildly. Through these young women, I wanted to explore the urge many of us feel to try to fix our broken world, and to understand how much we might risk when we resist, and the consequences of those risks to ourselves and our families, the costs of dissent. Like many activists caught up in the court system, my characters have to make impossible choices. Choices between loyalty to family, allegiance to the truth as they understand it, and commitment to social justice. Choices that can pit family members against each other. So picture this. It's August 1968, a hot day in Detroit. Rosa and Esther are marching through downtown with thousands of others, protesting the war in Vietnam. This is what it's like. The August air was charged with whiffs of marijuana and patchouli oil, the sulfur stench of asphalt softening in the heat, and the distant admonition of tear gas. Protesters overflowed the broad expanse of Woodward Avenue and spilled onto the sidewalk. Their chants ricocheted off the brick faces of the squat downtown buildings, and the excitement. Excitement had a peppery smell all its own. At the front of the demonstration, Esther let herself be pushed along by the zeal of the march. elbows linked with her sister Rosa on her left and their best friend Maggie on her right. Maggie lowered the bullhorn and handed it to Esther. "Your turn," Maggie said. Shaking her head, Esther passed the bullhorn to Rosa, who raised it to her lips. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Esther joined the chant, her voice hoarse, a good kind of sore. To their left, 3 8-foot-tall puppets, dressed in military uniforms splashed with red paint, danced to the chants. The puppets bobbled and bowed to the National Guard troops stationed in front of Hudson's department store. Beaming, Rosa squeezed Esther's arm against her ribs. "Isn't this great?" Esther squeezed back. She loved it all. Her sister's fireworks smile, and the 2 elderly women shuffling next to them sharing a metal walker, and the guy on the sidewalk cheering and waving his Detroit baseball cap, even though she could swear he was chanting, "Go get 'em, Tigers." Most of all, she loved feeling bonded, cell to cell, not only to Rosa and Maggie, but to every single one of the tens of thousands of people in the crowd, as they all marched for a single shared cause, ending the war in Vietnam. So as the sisters listen to the rally speakers, they hear a rumor that mounted police are beating protesters a few blocks away. They leave the rally and go to try to stop the violence. The tear gas haze was thicker ahead, clouds of it, or was that just her eyes blinking and weeping and stinging? A small crowd, maybe 3 dozen people, mostly young, swarmed the middle of the street. Facing them, standing between the protesters and the rally in Kennedy Square, 6 mounted police held their batons high in the air. One officer yelled through a bullhorn, "Get back on the sidewalks. You have no street permit for this location." A young woman wore 2 Viet Cong flags, safety pinned together instead of a shirt. The red tops covered her chest. The blue bottoms hung below her waist, and the yellow stars hovered half and half over her heart, front and back. "Let us through," she shouted at the cops. "We have the right to march." Esther stood on tiptoe, trying to see past the horses' broad rumps and braided tails. One cop swung his baton wildly, threatening the flag-wearing woman. This was going to be ugly, and Esther didn't want to be there. She caught up to Rosa. "Let's go back to the square. It's too dangerous." "You go if you want. I'm staying." Rosa ran around the line of horses towards the demonstrators. Esther lost sight of her sister and stood frozen on the sidewalk, torn between going back and going forward. Sticking close to Rosa and Maggie sounded like a good idea, but how could anything be safe with angry demonstrators and angrier cops ready to fight? She wanted to be home. If she were hurt, what would happen to Molly? Could tear gas poison breast milk? A scream. Someone in pain. Was it the flag-wearing woman? Was it Rosa? Esther ran in the direction her sister had gone and found her standing in the street. "We have to stop them before they kill somebody." Rosa reached into the backpack for a brown paper bag. She grabbed 4 green apples. She put one in Esther's hand, pressing her fingers around it. Esther stared at her sister. "Help me do this," Rosa said. Esther looked into the street, then down at her feet at the sidewalk. Clumps of grass grew in the thin lines of dirt through the jagged cracks. How had she, the quiet sister, the artist, the mother, ended up at the edge of a street fight, facing the rear ends of 6 police horses, rock-hard, apple in hand? In the street in front of her, one of the cops shouted a couple of words, quick and sharp. A command, it sounded like. Then all 6 policemen attacked. They leaned out over the protesters, truncheons swinging. "Now," Rosa said, She threw her apple hard at the officers. Rosa's face was so fierce that Esther had to look away. She studied the apple in her hand. Her fingertips searched the apple skin, seeking a soft spot, probing for a wormhole. Maybe it wasn't that hard, not like a rock, not really. Rosa threw a second apple and reached for the third. An officer stood tall in his stirrups and leaned way out over the crowd. He raised his baton above the flag-wearing woman. It smashed down on her head with a dreadful crack, and she sank to the street. Rosa grasped Esther's chin in her hand, brought Esther's gaze to her own face. "Throw with me, Esther, now," Rosa said. She pulled her arm back, ready. Esther hesitated. It was the right thing to do, wasn't it, to stop the cops from hurting people? She squeezed her eyes shut and hurled the apple as hard as she could. At the same instant, Rosa threw hers. She pictured their twin green spheres flying into the turmoil on the street together in the same graceful trajectory. Well, maybe not exactly the same. Rosa's probably flew straight and true, while her own wobbled a little and fell short. But still together, like sisters, together, even if they didn't agree about everything anymore. A horse screamed, sounding astonishingly human. Esther opened her eyes. The horse sidestepped wildly. The officer on its back, already leaning over with baton high, seemed to teeter in the air, then lose his balance. He yelped and tumbled off the saddle, disappearing into stamping hooves and brown rumps. Two cops dismounted. Another grabbed the bridle of the skittering horse. Had the horse been hit by an apple? Oh my God, did they do this? Did she do this? Well, the officer is badly injured and the sisters are arrested. For Rosa, their arrest offers another way to protest an unacceptable war through the courts. But Esther wants to avoid prison so she can stay home with her daughter. Reluctantly, she agrees to accept a plea bargain, which means she must testify against Rosa at trial. The sisters' decisions profoundly impact their relationship, and the consequences persist into the next generation, passed on to their daughters. I'm going to end with a short excerpt from Rosa's trial. Esther is in the witness box. Rosa sat at the defense table between her lawyers, refusing to look in the direction of the witness box. Good thing, because Esther didn't think she could hold her face intact if their eyes met. Rosa's lawyer must have given her the same speech about how dressing conventionally in court made a good impression on the jury. Rosa wore a white blouse under a loose blue cotton jumper. Her hair was gathered in a matching ribbon, and she had attached a gold circle pin to the rounded Peter Pan collar. Esther stifled a smile. If the jury had X-ray vision, if they could see beyond the gold-plated circle, through the blue jumper and cotton blouse, they'd be shocked. Because tattooed on Rosa's breast was a small red star, a 1/4 inch in diameter. Esther knew that tattoo well. It was the twin of hers. Getting matching tattoos had been Rosa's idea 2 summers before when they hitchhiked to San Francisco with Maggie. At first, Esther had been appalled. Tattoos are for sailors and gang members. That's going to change, Rosa said. You'll see. These tattoos will identify us as revolutionaries, will prove our commitment to the whole world. Esther had giggled. To whatever subset of the world we show our tits. Maggie had tried to reason with them about dirty instruments and infection and self-mutilation, but Esther didn't worry about pain or disease. She just wanted to capture the delicious moment and make it last. A tattoo is forever, she had thought, like a sister. Thank you.
Ellie, listening to you read those sections from the beginning just reminded me, you know, how wrenching a story this is about how the choices we make, sometimes really early in our lives, continue to haunt us.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly true for these sisters. The challenge for me in writing it was trying to make both of them nuanced and full characters, not one making the right choice and one making the wrong choice, but having the reader understand, and for me to understand, the full complexity of both of those choices.
Yeah, and you know, I felt it was very real. Very real for me, very real for how things play out in the world. Things are not black and white. But let's talk a little more about those, you know, the way the choices we make and the compromises that they involve sometimes, how they pull us apart and how they can also bring us together. But this pull of sort of the responsibilities we have to our family, particularly our children, and the responsibilities we feel as social justice activists to take on these larger issues, whether it's the war in Vietnam or climate change.
There's a point late in the novel when the adult daughter of the injured cop talks with Molly, the grown-up infant daughter of the section I read. And she says, it's not your family that determines who you become. It's not even your abilities. Your choices define you. And I've thought about that a lot in writing this. There are so many points in our lives and so many points in the lives of the characters in this book where they have to make a decision without knowing at all down the road what that will mean for their own life, for their family, and how their children will see those choices. So we make those decisions pretty blind, especially, as you said, when we're young. I think one of the things about Esther and Rosa is that they become locked into their choices. Yeah. Even though they try to reconcile at various points without giving away too much of the book, they try to reconcile, but they are so frozen in trying to defend to themselves mostly the choices that they have made, that they can't go back. They can't change things in order to reconcile.
And their wounds are so deep that it feels to me like that also gets in the way of any reconciliation. It's not just sort of an intellectual commitment to a well-reasoned position. It's, you know, choices they made when they were young, but choices that just wrenched apart this incredible bond that they had that you so eloquently write about. I mean, I sobbed at points.
I'm so glad to hear that.
And I was angry, you know?
Yeah.
I think...
what made you angry?
I was angry at Rosa more than Esther. And I think that's probably because I have two daughters of my own.
As do I.
As do you. And, you know, I was... But yet, as an anti-war activist in that same period of time in New York, I remember the I would call it rigidity now, but the passion, the commitment to a cause, the sense that this was an immediate danger whether it's the immediacy of the cops on their horses or the immediacy of what we were doing in Vietnam and our own young men who were dying for what.
Yeah.
I just remember sort of it being kind of blinders on people. And so I was angry at Rosa for, one, not recognizing what it meant that her sister had a child, a baby. I mean, doesn't she say early on that she's critical of Esther for not bringing Molly to the march?
Right, right.
You know, and as one of my daughters said to the other, I don't expect you to understand what it's like to have a child until you have one.
Right, right.
So I'm sort of interested in you know, I'm kind of thinking that each of these sisters represents a little bit of your own thinking. I mean, did you love them equally as you wrote about them?
I'm not sure if I loved them equally. I admired Rosa's passion, and I empathized with Esther's caution and her belief that she had a huge commitment to this baby and had to do right by her. You know, I think fiction does a really good job of asking these questions, but not answering them. Answering them is the job of the reader.
So, as much as I'd like to talk more about this, let's move on to sort of the next generation. You know, so eventually they both have daughters.
Yeah.
There's Molly and there's Emma, and Rosa and Esther make different decisions again about how to parent their daughters. And you know, Rosa teaches Emma about she you know, there's no hiding her past.
Yep.
There's no denying social justice, activism. She raises her daughter with a full sense of what she inherits from her grandparents' activism and from her mother's activism, and she's raised in that community. And for Esther, she distances herself. She denies all that. Her daughter grows up not knowing any of this story until somewhere in the novel. And so I'm reminded of this sort of this Hebrew phrase, Ledor Vador, which literally means from generation to generation. But it implies passing on to the next generation your values, your beliefs. These young women make different choices again. What's your thinking about that?
Well, it's not an accident, I suppose, that the first chapter of this book that I wrote was the scene in which Molly and Emma are both 12 years old and meet at summer camp. It's a little bit like a demented The Parent Trap, but these two cousins meet, and all of the structures that their families have built over their lives comes tumbling down when the two girls discover their relationship to each other and what the other family was like. And I think for me, that's where the story began, was the whole idea of children having legacies which they either know or don't know, and what are they going to do with that? And how are they going to feel about their parents who either shared that with them despite the pain of some of those situations, or who kept it a secret? And again, I feel like that's one of the centers, the heart of this book. I identified equally with the two young girls. You know, they're both 12 and they're both trying to figure out their roles in the world, and they've got this huge legacy to deal with, whether they knew about it or not, whether they want to follow it or not.
And, you know, there's a pride that Emma has
Yes.
in revealing all of this to her newfound cousin, right?
And Molly feels robbed,
Right.
deprived, furious.
Angry.
Yeah.
Angry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas, you know, Emma's anger is old anger. It's inherited anger.
Yeah.
It's part of how she was raised. It's anger that her mother spent time in prison. It's anger about her sister.
Yeah.
Her mother's sister. It's a lot. So the past. So I bring my past to it as a reader. You bring your past to it as a writer. You're married to Robbie Meeropol. He was one of the Rosenberg sons. Clearly, his parents made huge decisions that impacted his life. I mean, there was an opportunity for a different outcome, for Ethel to still be there to raise her sons. Made a different choice.
Yeah.
How did that impact your writing this?
You know, I started writing this novel 20 years ago. And so it's hard to remember what exactly sparked it. But clearly, at its center, the Rosenberg case is a story about siblings. David Greenglass lied and testified against his sister, sending her to the electric chair. He later admitted that he lied, and he did it in order to save his own wife and children. So I've lived with this case. I met Robbie when I was 19. I've lived with this case most of my life, and there's no question that in my mind, her sister's tattoo is in some way a fictional reflection of that story, with many, many changes in setting and time and outcome and all of that. You mentioned that there could have been a different outcome, and in fact, if Ethel and Julius had been willing to lie, to name names, to get other people involved, most likely Julius would have had a prison term, and Ethel, who wasn't really involved at all, would have been able to raise my husband and his brother. But that's not who they were. And the most telling thing I've ever heard Robbie say about that is that he would much rather be the son of Ethel and Julius than the son of David Greenglass.
Yes.
There you have it.
So we can talk more. We will. But tell me what you're working on now.
I'm writing a novel set on an imaginary street on the grounds of Northampton State Hospital. With the hospital and its patients as the backstory. It's a novel about an elderly woman, the wife of the last psychiatrist in charge of the hospital, fictional, who goes missing, and how the people of the community try to find her and deal with their very complicated legacy. It's been really interesting to write. Thank you so much, Dale. This has really been fun, and I appreciate you coming out and keeping our distance here. I hope that you'll buy her sister's tattoo, and you will buy it from Broadside Bookshop or your own favorite indie bookstore. Thank you so much for joining us.